Hey, it's Renee from the Craft Table. Thanks for being here for another week of our summer embroidery stitch along. It is week 11, which means it is the week of the satin stitch. The satin stitch is a stitch used to fill in an area. It is comprised of straight stitches stitched parallel, close together, side by side. On the surface, it seems like a very easy and straightforward stitch, and it isn't difficult because it is just a series of straight stitches. The success in getting a really clean, smooth satin stitch is making sure your stitches are right next to each other, but that they do not overlap one another and there are no gaps, and that the edges are smooth when you're stitching a particular shape. Within this embroidery hoop, there are quite a few areas where the satin stitch would be a very good stitch to use. I'm looking at these purple leaves here. That's a good area to do the satin stitch. You could do the stem of this orange flower. You could stitch these yellow half ovals. The inside of these long white ovals is another good place to do it. You can do this stem, you can do these leaves, you could do the little orange ovals inside this pink part of the flower. Using thread color EZ26, I'm going to use a satin stitch on these purple leaves. Before you start stitching an area with the satin stitch, you need to kind of decide if you want your stitches to go up and down, side to side, at an angle, depending on the shape. If you're doing an area like these large white ovals, I wouldn't recommend going from here to here because your stitches are going to be really long. I would probably do them in this direction or at an angle. With these smaller ovals, you could do it either way, but all these decisions are personal preference, depending on the look that you are going for with your stitching. I'm going to stitch the purple leaves, and I'm starting in the center. And I'm going to just take one straight stitch by placing my needle at the top of the shape that is in the center and pulling my needle and thread to the back. And then I'm going to work from the center out to this side, and then I'm going to then go back to the center and do my stitches on the left side. I could easily have started stitching from the left and gone all the way from one side of the leaf to the other. That is perfectly acceptable as well. I just like having the center stitch done first. It's sort of a registration mark for me. So for the next stitch, I'm bringing my needle up at the bottom of my shape, right next to the first stitch, and bringing my needle through to the top. And to complete the stitch, I'm taking my needle down at the top of the shape, again, making sure it's right next to the previous stitch. And then I'm pulling my needle to the back. As the shape of my leaf changes, so will the height of my stitches. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I mean. So as I make my way from the center to the right, you will see that my stitches are going to be getting shorter and shorter because the shape changes. And they might even angle a little bit as I get to this part of the shape. And I'm trying to make my stitches as smooth as possible, getting as close to the previous stitch as I can without actually stitching over it. I'm trying not to pull too tightly, as I don't want my fabric to pucker. Now it's time to work the left side of the leaf. The other purple leaf has been stitched using the satin stitch. So both of those purple moon-shaped leaves on the orange flower were done in the satin stitch. I came over to this flower and I used the satin stitch on those orange ovals inside the pink part of the flower, stitching the satin stitch vertically. And then this flower here, I did the satin stitch on the two ovals. You can go around your stitching with a back stitch or a chain stitch or stem stitch. I embroidered the satin stitch on those two tall white ovals inside this rust-colored flower. I did my stitching horizontally, and I started in the center, I worked my way up, and then I went back to the center and worked my way down. And if you notice, the shape on the left has a back stitch stitched around the tall oval. And that is an option that you can do either after you've done your satin stitching, or you can even outline the area first and then stitch the satin stitch inside that shape. If I think adding a stitch around will just, make the shape look smoother or cover up some wonky stitching, then that's usually when I decide to add a back stitch. Now that I have stitched one shape, of course, I'm going to go back and add the back stitch to the other just so it looks consistent. I did a stem stitch on that center line with 3 lazy daisy stitches at the top. These are 3 areas where I have stitched the satin stitch on my panel, with them being different shapes and me stitching them in different directions. It gives you an idea of how you can apply the satin stitch to your panel and other places where you can embroider this stitch. Enjoy trying out the satin stitch in various places. Let me know if you have any questions about this stitch or any of the other stitches that we have learned so far. And I will see you next week when we talk about the pistol stitch. In the meantime, happy stitching.